Again. Good morning, everyone. My name is Jody King, and I am the contract specialist with the Alaska Procurement Technical Assistance Center, or PTAC. And this morning, we have a fabulous presenter dealing with a local blizzard, while those of us in Anchorage are dealing with, I think we're actually warmer. He said it was 10 degrees there when we were talking earlier. So welcome him to the warmer northern climate, if only virtually. And we're going to have a fabulous discussion on the SBA size and affiliation rules. And this is a fabulous topic. We heard those of us that were at the APTAC conference this past fall heard Matt present on this. And there were some tricks and turns to pay attention to that it was an education for all of us. So we want to thank Matt for presenting that today. But before we bring on our guest speaker, I want to go over a few housekeeping rules for you, just to call your attention to the GoToMeeting panel. A few things: the slides have been made available under the handout section of your GoToWebinar panel. If for any reason you are attending by cell phone or tablet and are unable to download those tablets, you are welcome to reply to your webinar invite email and ask for them, and I'll be happy to send those out. Also, we want to have a conversation. I know it's more challenging in the virtual world, especially when you log in and you're automatically muted. However, there's a couple of different ways you can get your questions to us. So you can either type the question in the question box, and we'll have a little question mark pop up next to your name on the attendee list, or you can simply raise your hand, again, if you're on the tablet or smartphone and just don't feel like typing. Go ahead and click the raise hand feature, and we'll be happy to unmute you from this end, let you unmute yourself, and then have that conversation. So almost as good as being in person, but still that ability for us to share. So please feel free to add questions and comment. It really helps improve the discussions are always fabulous. The next thing I want to note is this webinar is being recorded. So if you do have an unmuted mic, just be aware that the event is being recorded, and we do have an attorney presenting for a little bit of attorney humor. But this recording will be posted on the Alaska PTAC website and should be up the latest by Monday. Usually we have that out within 24 hours. So just heads up on that as well. So just really quickly, just in case our attendees today are not familiar with the Alaska PTAC, the Procurement Technical Assistance Center, what I'd like you to take away today, if you don't already really know us well, is we provide free assistance with all aspects of government contracting, from cradle to grave, start to finish, for federal, state, and local purchasing activity. And a lot of our clients know we help and provide assistance for federal contracting, but now's a great time to expand that we do provide assistance with state of Alaska contracts as well as local, by which I mean the municipality, the boroughs, city of Wasilla, et cetera. So that local level of government contracting. We are one of 90 other PTACs across the US. There's one in Puerto Rico and Guam. And the reason I like to bring this up, so if any of you have businesses that are expanding, moving into different geographic regions, it's nice, excuse me, it's nice to let you know that there's PTACs across the US as well. And if you go to our association website, which is that bottom link there, the aptac-us.org, you can see a list of all of the various PTACs. Just click on the state and you can see who's around you for expanding in that region. Because while we all are very well versed in federal, each one of us is kind of our own local expert for state and local contracting for our area. So it's nice to check them out, check out their website. Great resource if you're moving into a new geographic region. And last but not least, the PTAC is excuse me, the PTAC is hosted by the Business Enterprise Institute. Our grant is within the university. Good heavens, I'm stumbling over this. Our grant program is hosted within the University of Alaska, Anchorage, and within that university, we are under the Business Enterprise Institute. It's a fabulous program within the university, and we're one of 9 other programs. So we're co-housed with the Small Business Development Center as well, for example. So that's us in a nutshell. And again, that takeaway is we provide that free assistance. So if you're running into questions, anything related to government contracting, feel free to reach out to PTAC first. So thank you for that. So Matt, at this time, I'm going to go ahead and make you presenter.
Great.
All right, so if you would share your screen again.
Can you see it?
Not yet. There it is.
There we go.
All right, thank you. So Matt, the mic is all yours.
Well, thank you so much, Jody. It's a pleasure to be back with you virtually, back among friends at the Alaska PTAC. And let me say that I echo everything Jody said at the beginning. That is, if you are a federal government contractor, no matter if you're just breaking in or if you're well established, I recommend that you reach out to your local PTAC for assistance. They offer a wonderful variety of assistance to federal government contractors, and I think that they're a tremendous resource for the government contracting community. And I am thrilled to partner with PTACs all across the country, especially in Alaska, to bring educational seminars. And today I'm happy to talk about SBA's size and affiliation rules, because obviously when we're talking about small business federal government contracting opportunities, one of the main things, one of the main considerations is, well, what is a small business? And so today we'll talk about what makes a business small, and importantly, how your small business might actually be a large business through a concept called affiliation. And we'll discuss more about that today. I am the managing member of Schoonover and Moriarty. We are a law firm here in Kansas City, blizzardy Kansas City. I'm not sure if you can see out of my window behind me, but we are currently having some Alaska-like weather. So yes, I wish I were up with you now to avoid the snow and the ice. But we are a law firm outside of Kansas City that works exclusively with federal government contractors, primarily small businesses, but exclusively with federal government contractors across a variety of industries and service areas all across the country. And so although I am an attorney, please don't take today's presentation to be legal advice. If you have specific questions about your business, I hope today's presentation is educational and informative, but please do not consider it to be legal advice. Certainly reach out to PTAC, reach out to a government contracts attorney, myself, any of the others that do this, for specific legal advice relating to your business. So with that, just a quick kind of roadmap of what we'll talk about today. I mentioned that, you know, the threshold question for small business federal government contracting is your business small? And so we'll talk about why it's important to be a small business, and of course, how the SBA actually determines business size. And then we'll spend the latter half of the presentation today, or our hour together today, talking about affiliation. I always say that affiliation is the second dirtiest rule or second dirtiest word, excuse me, in federal government contracting, because it can turn small businesses large. If you're wondering what the dirtiest word in federal government contracting is, it's always the F word. No, it's actually always debarment. But affiliation, certainly for small businesses, is right up there, because it can take, or it can make your small business large, sometimes without you even knowing it. So it's important to know what affiliation is, and importantly, how to guard against it. Before we break in too much, though, I did want to give a quick plug to our blog, govconbrief.com. On GovConBrief, we talk about a variety of these topics as they relate to small business federal government contractors. And importantly, try to keep our posts pretty brief, as the name implies. So if you haven't checked out GovConBrief yet, I would certainly encourage you to do so. We write about a variety of topics, and I hope it's certainly one of your resources going forward. So with that, let's go ahead and kind of break into it and start our discussion today at the outset by discussing why business size matters when it comes to federal government contracts. I think that there is sometimes a perception, perhaps a misperception, that in order to be a successful business or a successful government contractor, you've got to be huge. You've got to be Lockheed Martin, you've got to be Boeing, SAIC, Raytheon, these type of companies that are household names in the industry. And you really have to be, one of the huge players on the block. That's not true. We see that the federal government prioritizes, in some cases, awards to small businesses. Small businesses are a crucial part of the federal government contracting scheme, and every year the federal government gets closer and closer to the $1 trillion mark in federal government contract spending. It's over half a $500 billion annually. I think it's actually getting closer to $750 billion every year in federal government contract spending. And small businesses, as I mentioned, play a vital role in that. In fact, the Small Business Act sets goals for small business participation in federal government contracting. Currently, at least 23% of all prime contract awards under the Small Business Act should go to small businesses. And there are sub goals or goals for different socioeconomic categories as well. And so the federal government tries its best to issue small business contract awards each year. And we see this reflected in the latest numbers. The data on the screen here comes straight from the SBA. The SBA every year publishes a goal card or a scorecard for how the federal government does in awarding these contracts to small businesses. And we see the goals, the 2020 goals for each small business and the various socioeconomic categories, and how the federal government did against those goals. And by and large, it was very successful. In terms of dollars, the federal government awarded a record $146 billion in small business prime contract awards in fiscal year 2020. $146 billion. That's an incredible amount of money awarded to small businesses. And so I mentioned before that being a small business, small businesses do play that vital role. There is a huge pie here for small businesses. And of course, there are smaller pieces of that pie depending on your socioeconomic status. Again, for woman-owned small businesses, service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses, SDBs, 8A businesses, and hub zone businesses, the federal government is going to try to award a certain dollar amount in contracts to you each year. By and large, again, it's successful. We see that certainly for 8A businesses, the federal government blew away its goal and awarded almost $59 billion in contracts to 8A businesses or SDBs in fiscal year 2020. Same with the service-disabled veteran-owned small businesses. Once again, it blew away its goal, well exceeded that. For woman-owned small businesses, it's a little bit of a closer story where after exceeding the goal in 2019, fell below it in 2020. Hub zone businesses, businesses that are in what are called historically underutilized business development zones, generally areas that have seen economic struggles, disasters. Maybe they're on a Native American reservation, maybe they're in a base closure area. These areas, the federal government says we want to award at least 3% of our contracts each year to hub zone businesses with the goal of bringing dollars into these underutilized zones. And I think it's a tremendous shame that the federal government falls short of that every year, consistently falls short of its hub zone goal every year. And we see that only about $14 billion in contract awards were made to hub zone businesses. Nonetheless, notwithstanding that failure, I hope the chart here shows you that as a small business, you certainly do have a market within the federal government. Odds are that if you sell a good or a product or a service, there's a market for it with the federal government. And not only under a prime contract award. One of the overlooked aspects of being a small business is the ability to subcontract work from other businesses. Oftentimes large businesses or what we call unrestricted contract awards carry a subcontracting plan, where the federal government wants to make sure that these businesses are giving subcontracts to small businesses and various socioeconomic categories as well. And again, we see billions of dollars in opportunity here for small businesses, even outside of being a prime contractor. So again, there's tremendous opportunity as a small business to work with the federal government in some form or another. Being a small business opens a lot of doors. First of all, you can qualify for any of the SBA's socioeconomic programs. That is, the threshold eligibility requirement for each of the Woman-Owned Small Business Program, 8A Business Development Program, Service Disabled Veteran-Owned Small Business Program, and the Hub Zone program are that your business is a small business under its primary NAICS code, and of course has to continue to be a small business throughout its participation. So if you're interested in any of these programs, you first must be a small business and then meet any of the other programmatic eligibility requirements as well. Then of course, there are also contract-specific benefits. As a small business, you may be eligible for set-aside opportunities or set-aside contracts open to any of these socioeconomic opportunity or programs. And when I say set-aside contracts, I mean contracts that are specifically set aside for small businesses or for members of those socioeconomic programs. That is, competition for those opportunities is restricted to those businesses. And in some cases, you might not even be awarded a competitive contract. You could be eligible for what we call sole source contracts or directed awards. That is, awards where the government doesn't necessarily have to go through the competitive process, but rather it can identify you, say, as a woman-owned small business or an 8A participant and say, we're going to give you a directed award if these requirements are met. So certainly there are benefits, there are opportunities from a contracting standpoint when it comes to being a small business. If it matters that your business is small, let's next talk about how SBA will determine whether your business is actually small. And sometimes, you know, I'll talk with clients or prospective clients, and they'll assume that their business is small. After all, you know, when you're working in the business every day, when you've built it up, or when you've just started it, it seems like it's a small business. But it's not a hunch, it's not a guess, it's not a feeling that SBA will use to determine your business's size. Rather, it's a science. And so first, what the SBA is going to do is start with the North American Industry Classification System code, or NAICS code, at issue. And NAICS codes are essentially 6-digit codes that were developed by the Census Bureau to describe each of the economy's sectors and industries. Those codes, no matter what they are, could be IT related services, could be construction services, you know, roofing or tile floors or whatever the case may be, could be dog and cat food manufacturing. Each industry has a 6-digit code that is assigned to it. And the SBA, for each of those codes, assigns a corresponding size standards. Those size standards come in 2 varieties. The first is going to be a dollar-based or a receipts-based size standard that applies to services NAICS codes within the service industry, including construction, or employee-based size standards that generally apply to manufacturing and supply-based industries. If your business's size falls under the NAICS code, or the size standard is under that NAICS code or assigned to that NAICS code, then you are a small business under that NAICS code. For SBA socioeconomic program eligibility, the NAICS coded issue is going to be your business's primary NAICS code. That is the NAICS code under which you do most of your work. You know, a lot of times, or when you register in SAM, you generally have to tell them your primary industry. That's not a set it and forget it type thing. I recommend that clients, you know, review that at least annually, perhaps even more frequently than that, to really assess what their primary NAICS code is, and if required, to adjust it in SAM. And the reason why is because it's that primary NAICS code that's going to establish socioeconomic program eligibility. Know that if you're, you know, say in the 8A program and you want to adjust your primary NAICS code, there's a process by which you have to go about and do that under those specific programs. But in general, if you're just registering or if you're a small business, you can really go in and choose the NAICS code under which you do the majority of your work. Now, to be eligible for a small business set-aside contract opportunity, or a contract opportunity that is set aside under any of the socioeconomic programs, you must be a small business under the NAICS code that the contracting officer assigns to that procurement. For each procurement, the contracting officer is obligated to choose one NAICS code that most closely corresponds to the solicitation's primary purpose. And that NAICS code will have a corresponding size standard. And so those businesses that are eligible for that contract are going to be those businesses who are small under the NAICS code that is assigned to that solicitation. Now, what happens if you think that the contracting officer has assigned an incorrect NAICS code? Maybe they have assigned a NAICS code that has a small size standard and you are too large under that size standard and thus potentially shut out from that procurement. Or alternatively, maybe the contracting officer has assigned a NAICS code that has a really big size standard assigned to it, and your size is much smaller, and you're sitting there thinking, well, I know I qualify as a small business, but so do all of these other companies. And the fact that they're going to be bidding on this means I have a much lower chance at receiving the award. If you think that the contracting officer has assigned an incorrect NAICS code, or if the assignment of the NAICS code impacts your competitive standing in some way, consider a NAICS code appeal. You can appeal to SBA's Office of Hearings and Appeals a NAICS code designation, generally arguing that the assigned NAICS code does not adequately respond to or refer to the solicitation's primary purpose, and instead maybe a different NAICS code should apply. NAICS codes are an underutilized, I think, underutilized competitive tool among small businesses, but just know that you have to act fast when it comes time to file a NAICS code appeal. They're generally due no later than 10 days after the solicitation was issued. So I always recommend that folks take a look at the solicitation, review it carefully, and see whether there's a basis to challenge a NAICS code. And if so, act fast. Make sure you file it within that 10-day period after the solicitation is issued. So there are two types of size standards I mentioned. There's receipts-based and there's employee-based size standards. For receipts-based, receipts is a term of art under the SBA's regulations. It means something. Receipts are defined as a company's total income added to its cost of goods sold as those items are reported on the company's tax returns. Total income and cost of goods sold added together. Now, when you add those amounts together, you'll get your annual receipts. SBA will calculate your annual receipts for the preceding 5 completed fiscal years and average those amounts together. If those average receipts falls below the assigned size standard, congratulations, your business is small. But if it's even $1 over, you're a large business. There are two sizes of businesses according to the federal government: small and large, or small and other than small. And so for a receipts-based size standard, you're going to calculate your average annual receipts over the preceding 5 completed fiscal years. It used to be 3 completed fiscal years. And then the SBA allowed for a transition period where they said 3 or 5 completed fiscal years. Now it's preceded 5 completed fiscal years. So there is no ability to choose a 3-year or rely on a 3-year size calculation any longer. I mentioned it's as these numbers are reported on your tax return. So just, if you file a Form 1120, line 2 is cost of goods sold, line 11 is total income. You'll add those amounts together and get your receipts for the year. 1120S, it's lines 2 and line 6, or a Form 1065, it's line 2 and line 8 is how you'll determine your receipts for the year. Now, what happens if you haven't filed tax returns for a completed fiscal year? Well, then the SBA will look to other information to determine your receipts for those years. It'll look to your accounting records. It'll consider any books or information provided to your accountant. It might even consider a declaration from somebody who knows what your receipts would be for that year. It does not mean that you are able to just kind of omit that year from the calculation. Rather, SBA will look to other evidence. But know that if you have completed tax returns for a fiscal year, those tax returns are determinative of your receipts for that year. So if you file tax returns that indicate you've got total income of $1 million and cost of goods sold of $200 million, your accountant, in response to a size determination, can't send a letter that says, well, I was wrong, and really it should have, rather than $200 million, it was actually $2 million, and that was a goof. They'll use what's on your tax returns as being determinative if they are filed with the IRS. Just a quick example for receipts calculation. I mentioned that it used to be a 3 or a 5-year average, and we see why this matters for some businesses on the screen. Here we have a business, let's assume that the receipts calculation period ended in 2020. We've got a business that's been growing over those preceding 5 completed fiscal years. Under a 5-year average, they are small. Under a 3-year average, they are large. But I note that no longer can you choose a 3-year calculation period. You are stuck with a 5-year calculation period. Conversely, though, we see kind of some of the impact that this change might have to businesses who are declining in revenues. And the business that's on the screen is cratering. They've had a heck of a last half decade, and their total receipts every year are falling dramatically. It used to be that this business should have chosen the 3-year average under SBA's regulation. Now, no longer. It can no longer do that. It is stuck with the 5-year average. So I apologize for the text at the bottom of the screen here, but this business would be considered a large business under, say, a $12 million or $11 million size standard. Based on the 5-year calculation, because again, it is including some of these earlier larger receipts. There are also employee-based size standards, as I mentioned. These generally apply to manufacturing and supply-based NAICS codes. And in general, SBA is going to count the average number of employees for each pay period over the preceding 12 calendar months. I will note, though, that as I'm standing here today, SBA has a proposed rule out there that is going to change this calculation period from 12 to 24 months. We expect this change to go into effect sometime this year in 2022, probably towards the end of the calendar year. But know that if you calculate employees based on, or excuse me, if you have an employee-based calculation, that metric will soon be changing. Right now it's still 12 months, but it will soon be 24 months. So the question is, when it comes to employees, who is an employee? Who counts? And really, it's any employee on a full-time, part-time, or other basis, including those employees that come from temporary or leasing agencies. It does not, however, consider volunteers. But again, I don't know of a lot of manufacturing companies that use volunteer labor, so that might not apply. What about independent contractors? Well, definitionally, bona fide independent contractors are not employees. But how do you know if somebody's actually an independent contractor? A lot of times I see companies just call somebody an independent contractor when in actuality, that person probably should be classified as an employee. Now, I'm not an employment attorney, but what I can say is each state has different rules about what makes somebody an employee versus an independent contractor. If you use independent contractors to any extent in your business, I always recommend that folks speak with a local employment attorney so that they can understand, first of all, whether that person is actually classified, properly classified as an independent contractor, and if so, to make sure that they have a good independent contractor agreement that will protect that status and protect the company in case something were to happen. Now, if you get it wrong, there's not only considerations when it comes to, say, employee counts for SBA size standards, but of course there are state law and tax considerations to keep in mind as well. So this is something that your business, again, if you rely on independent contractors, this is something that you need to keep in mind so that your business is doing things properly as it is using those. So when is size determined? That is, there has to be a fixed point in time by which SBA will determine size for your business. Because a business size, when you think about it, is going to fluctuate from 1 month to the next. Heck, it might fluctuate from 1 week or even 1 day to the next, depending on the calculation. And so there needs to be a fixed point under which SBA is going to determine business size. Now, for socioeconomic program eligibility, it's generally date of application and or date of program admission. You have to be a small business at both times, and then of course maintain your small business status throughout your time in the socioeconomic program. For contractual eligibility, though, it's a little bit more nuanced. The general rule is that a business size is determined as of the date the company submits its initial offer under a solicitation that includes price. So long as you're small on that date, the date that you submit your initial offer that includes price, in general, you will be considered to be a small business for that contract award and throughout that contract award, even if you were otherwise to grow to be a large business. Now, that rule has some nuance, as I mentioned. If for IDIQs where there's no price submitted, size is determined as of the date of the initial offer that includes price. Or for unrestricted IDIQ contracts, for these large-based contracts or multiple award-based contracts, where they're issued on an unrestricted basis. That is, any business, regardless of its size or its status, can earn one of these contracts. If an unrestricted IDIQ contract holder bids on a small business task order under that IDIQ, the business would have to be small as of the date it submits its bid for the task order, its initial bid for the task order. Even though once you have the contract, you could be required to recertify your size in some cases. If you're bidding on a task order, even if it's a small business IDIQ and it's a set aside task order, If the contracting officer asks for a recertification with any specific task order, you would have to recertify your eligibility as a small business to be eligible for that task order. If it's a long-term contract, that is a contract whose duration extends for more than 5 years, inclusive of options, then within 120 days prior to the end of year 5, your business would have to recertify as a small business. Or if there's some type of contract novation, or if the contractor has been acquired or merged, or there's been some type of change in control through an acquisition of the company, then they'll also have to recertify as a small business as a result of those instances. What happens if your business isn't able to recertify as a small business? Well, one of two things has the possibility of happening. First of all, the contracting officer has the right to terminate your contract for convenience. They always have that ability to do so. And they could say, you're no longer a small business, appreciate everything you've done, but we're going to terminate the contract. Or they have the ability to allow you to continue to perform under the contract, but to no longer claim small business goaling credit for that continued performance. And I don't want to speak in absolutes, but oftentimes, particularly where performance is going well, or you know, the contracting officer doesn't have a lot of other options, I think oftentimes it is willing to allow that contract to continue under those circumstances. Now, if it's a multiple award IDIQ, and there are 10 other small businesses that hold the contract, and you're not able to recertify as a small business, then the contracting officer in that case may be more inclined to say, okay, thank you, we're going to terminate your contract, or you know, we're not going to initiate any more orders, or whatever the case may be. It all depends on the situation, but if your business is facing a recertification issue, I would encourage you to reach out to PTAC or to counsel so that you can kind of talk through some of these issues and best understand the strategy going forward with the government to hopefully minimize any of those risks of potentially a lost contract. So we know how size is determined, we know when size is determined, and we know why being a small business is important, but that's not the end of it. Because there's a crucial concept when we talk about small business size status that really impacts small business eligibility. And I mentioned that topic is affiliation. I think affiliation is a tremendously nefarious issue in some cases because it can turn a small business large, sometimes without the small business even knowing it. That is, due to an affiliation with another company, a small business might be considered to be a large business. So let's unpack what affiliation is and hopefully how to avoid it. Affiliation under SBA's regulations is, in essence, the power to control. One business or one person has the power to control another. That's affiliation under SBA's regulations. That power doesn't necessarily have to be exercised. That is, it can just exist in the documents, the corporate documents for the business. So long as that power to control exists, SBA may find affiliation. That power can also be positive or negative, and I don't mean some normative assessment of good or bad, but rather I mean, you know, by positive control, I mean if one person positively controls another, that person can tell them what to do, and because of that control, the other person has to do it. That's positive control. Negative control, on the other hand, think of it as like withheld consent. So if somebody wants to do something or a business wants to do something and they have to get another person's or another business's permission to do it before they can do it, that's negative control. I had this issue pop up one time with a client, and it oftentimes, as the case may be, when it comes to affiliation, they didn't know they had a problem. And I was talking to them about something wholly unrelated, and they mentioned something about how their husband was like an executive vice president in another business and was on the board. And I said, oh, okay, well, we'll need to talk about that, because if it's your husband and he's on the board, there could be control issues there under affiliation. And if so, we'll need to unpack that. He said, well, you know, he's on the board, but he doesn't do anything, and the other guy runs it, and all of this stuff. I said, oh, I get it, but I'd feel a lot better if you know, your husband could send me that company's operating agreement. And so they did, lo and behold. That operating agreement essentially said that the husband, who really had no day-to-day role in the company, wasn't doing anything for the company, and in fact was, you know, trying to get out of it, was essentially the way the operating agreement was written, because there were only 2 directors, essentially had veto power over everything the company did. Now, they told me, they said, that's not how it works. He's not even involved. They don't do anything. He doesn't do anything. He doesn't even, you know, all of this type of stuff. And I said, I get it. But under these documents, if the SBA were to look at this, they would say that this is affiliation, that this is control. And so we had to fracture that affiliation. We had to revise those documents to remove that ability there to say he doesn't control this company, not even negatively. He can't withhold consent, and that means the company can't do anything. And as I mentioned, you know, that it doesn't necessarily matter how things work on the ground. If the documents at issue reveal a potential affiliation, then SBA is perhaps going to find it. Conversely, if the documents say there is no affiliation, but the facts on the ground indicate that there are, SBA still might find affiliation. It's going to look to the totality of the circumstances between the relationship of the parties to determine whether affiliation exists between them. And so what are some common ways, or what are the ways that SBA might find affiliation between two companies? Now, the quintessential, the archetypal way that SBA is going to find affiliation is through common ownership by one person of 2 or more companies. If one person owns 50% or more of multiple firms, those firms are going to be affiliated no matter what. It's an irrebuttable presumption. There's also the issue, though, of if a firm has minority owners, if not a single person holds a majority interest in the business, if they're all minority owners, then even the person who holds the largest minority share could be deemed to control that business, even if it's less than 50%, especially if that ownership percentage is large when compared to the others. So we see, you know, an example on the screen where there's 3 owners that each own 30% and another 20 that each own 0.5%. In that instance, SBA is going to tell those 3 owners, hey, you all control this company, even though none of you individually owns more than 50%. Now, this rule can be rebutted. You know, you can say, hey, even though I'm in there, I don't control, I'm not, you know, I don't vote, I don't have a vote, I don't do anything, I'm a passive owner. You can maybe rebut this rule, but it does open things up for affiliation. Now, also when the SBA considers ownership, it's going to give present effect to any type of stock options or convertible notes or agreements to merge or anything like that. It's essentially going to treat those agreements or those options as if they have been entered or exercised to determine what the true impact of that affiliation is. So in other words, you can't avoid common ownership affiliation by saying, you know, well, he doesn't really own 50%, he has the option to buy 50%. They would say, well, we're going to treat that option as if it's been exercised. Common management affiliation is another way. If the managers or key personnel, if the officers or directors of one business who control that business also control the management of another firm, then SBA is likely to find those 2 firms to be affiliated with each other by virtue of common management. Now, what happens if, say, you know, there is one common manager, between two businesses who each have 5 managers. You know, if it's just one of the managers who is common and there's no continuing ties between them or no other relationships between them, SBA might not view that as sufficient to trigger affiliation between the companies. But again, it will look to the totality of the circumstances. So if those businesses have a relationship with each other, if that person holds other positions within those businesses, particularly if they're an owner of both or something like that, then that may impact whether affiliation exists. SBA may also find affiliation due to what's called identity of interest, where firms or business owners share interests that are substantially identical, or economic interests that are substantially identical. And there's 3 main types of identity of interest affiliation. The first is a close familial relationship between business owners. If firms that are owned or controlled by close family members, and there are business relationships between these two companies. And so when we talk about close familial relationships, I don't mean, you know, my second cousin twice removed who lives, you know, in New Jersey, but I talk to them every Sunday, and I've talked to them every Sunday for the last 30 years. That's not who I'm talking about. I'm talking about close relationships. Parties that are married or part of a civil union, husband and wife, or partners with each other, parents and children, and siblings. If any one of those close relationships owns a business and they've got somebody else that owns a business, and there are relationships between those two businesses, SBA may find identity of interest affiliation between them. Again, this is a rebuttable presumption. So if you know, I own a law firm, hypothetically, and my mom owns a dry cleaning business, they might not be affiliated with each other, even if we both own businesses. And you know, obviously we meet the close familial relationship requirements. If we show that we don't do a lot of business together, we can probably rebut that finding of affiliation. Now, that doesn't mean that I can't take my dry cleaning to my mom's business, lest I risk affiliation between us. Rather, SBA will look at, as I mentioned, the totality of the circumstances. And if I get a suit cleaned or some shirts pressed, whatever the case may be, that's probably fairly small in the grand scheme of things. Economic dependence affiliation is another one. If one firm is economically dependent on another for at least 70% of its revenues, SBA is probably going to find those firms to be affiliated with each other. Think about it. I say jump, you say how high. That's kind of how I view economic dependence affiliation. If your business depends on mine for 70% or more of its revenue, and I threaten to take my business elsewhere, that's probably some level of negative control. Now, there are some ways around this. I caution people that don't view that 70% number as hard and fast. That's what's in the regulations, yes. But even if you're, you know, at 65%, there might be continuing relationships between the parties that, even if it doesn't meet the letter of the law here, there could be a risk of affiliation elsewhere. So I tell folks 70% is the threshold, but as you get closer to that, you need to have a yellow light and eventually a red light flashing that says, I need to diversify with whom I do business to avoid this. Of course, there is also, you know, some leeway for businesses who just start out, because in that case, obviously, you know, the first contract a business gets, our first client, we were 100% dependent on them. And of course, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're economically dependent from affiliation standpoint, it just means that we're still out chasing contracts. Common investments, this one's less common. We don't see this one pop up as much, but really if individuals share investments that provide economic control, and really here SBA is going to look at the size of the portfolio and the various holdings that the individuals have in them to determine whether there's basis for common investment affiliation. Newly organized concern rule, I dubbed the Spinoff Rule. That's where, you know, current or former or current key personnel of one company spin off a new company, and those two companies continue to have relationships with each other. SBA may find affiliation based on the newly organized concern rule. Again, this can be rebutted by showing a clear line of fracture between the businesses, but just know that obviously the more resources that are shared between the companies, the more employees or the more contracts, excuse me, there's going to increase that risk of affiliation between them. Joint venture affiliation, I think, is really fun just because it's interesting from a legal standpoint. In general, joint ventures, I don't mean it's fun like you should go out and become affiliated with your joint ventures. I mean, it's fun for me to think about from a legal standpoint. In general, joint ventures receive an exemption from affiliation, from the rules of affiliation under the joint venture agreement. That is, you know, they're not going to find joint ventures to be affiliated with each other because they're a part of a joint venture if that joint venture plays by SBA's rules. And that is, all ventures have to be small, separately small. They have to be individually small unless they're part of an approved mentor-protege agreement, and they have a compliant joint venture agreement. If those two requirements are met, then in general, the joint venture gets an exemption from affiliation, but not always, because sometimes a JV outstays its welcome. You know, a joint venture is intended to be a limited purpose, limited duration entity that just tries to perform a few contracts. SBA's rules say that if a joint venture bids on new contract opportunities more than 2 years after it wins its first award, those ventures risk general affiliation between them. So today is February 17th, 2022, all day. February 17th, 2022, you and I have a joint venture, and today we're awarded our first contract as a joint venture. Our joint venture can continue to bid on new contract awards until February 17th, 2024. At that point, we can no longer bid on any new contracts unless we want to risk affiliation. Now, we could just form a new joint venture that will then bid on new contracts. That's totally fine. We could also continue to perform contracts that we were awarded prior to that cutoff date, or even that we bid prior to the cutoff date, even if they're awarded after that date. So that's an important thing to keep in mind if you're bidding as a joint venture. You need to kind of keep the time limitation involved. Also, for prime subcontractor teams, uniquely to prime subcontractor teams, there's the possibility of ostensible subcontractor affiliation. Ostensible subcontractor affiliation arises where a subcontractor either performs the contract's primary and vital requirements, or the prime is unusually reliant on the subcontractor. And SBA has a variety of factors that they use to determine whether a company is performing the primary and vital requirements or is otherwise unusually reliant on its subcontractor. And I raise this to keep in mind as you are bidding on opportunities as a prime sub team. You need to think about ostensible subcontractor affiliation as you're framing your teaming agreements and your subcontracts, and as you're working together on your proposal to make sure you don't run afoul of the ostensible subcontractor affiliation rule. So those are some of the common ways that SBA is going to find affiliation between two companies. And I raise them not necessarily to make everybody an expert in affiliation. I've been practicing in this area of law for several years, and there are still nuances to each of these rules that pop up and that I have to go review the regs and case law and everything like that just to make sure that my understanding is correct. Rather, I raise them so that when you're going through your relationship with other companies, or when you're preparing your teaming agreements or your joint venture agreements, when you're bringing on another partner, or when you're negotiating issues, something, maybe the hair on the back of your neck stands up a little bit and you say, I think that guy from Kansas City talked to me about this. Maybe I need to reach out to PTAC, or maybe I need to reach out to Matt or another government contracts attorney just to make sure there's no issues here. Because if so, I could be risking my small business status. And that's the importance of understanding affiliation. It is hard to eliminate all potential affiliations at the outset, but to protect against it, you really need to understand those risks before they become an issue. Because again, once that date for size determination passes, you can't go back and fix it after the fact. If your size is protested, you can't tell the SBA in response, oops, my bad, we'll fix it. That is, they'll say, no, you're not eligible. And so you need to know of these risks well in advance. Know them before you submit bids or before you apply for socioeconomic programs so that you can address any risks. And importantly, review these solicitations and structure your relationships in a way that's going to comply with the requirements. And if you think that there's a risk of affiliation, consider how to fracture it. And my word choice there is intentional because fracturing that affiliation can be hard, it can be painful. You know, you say fracture and you kind of think, oh, yeah, sometimes it can be. You know, maybe it means you have to change your ownership or let go of a manager or reduce business relationships with another company. Maybe it means passing on a specific contract opportunity that you think you'd otherwise do really well in. I mean, these are things that might have to be at play depending on the relationship. Of course, after auditing your size standard or your affiliation risks, you know, you might say, listen, I know I've got a risk of affiliation here. And I know that that means if there is affiliation, I know that there's a risk I'm a large business. But it's worth it to me to remain a large business or to be a large business versus fracturing that affiliation. The benefit I get from that affiliation outweighs losing my small business status. Maybe you decide that that's the case, but that's only something that you can decide after fully understanding the issues, after conducting that audit, so to speak, or that review of potential affiliation. So know this kind of, you know, I see that business owners need to do this kind of regularly, at least every year, so that they understand, and as they're forecasting out their growth areas and what it is, you know, their next year looks like, they can keep these things in mind so that they can make those informed strategic decisions. Then also, if there are risks of affiliation, maybe consider joining SBA's mentor-protege relationship. One of the benefits of SBA's mentor-protege program is that the parties are generally shielded from affiliation only for the items of approved assistance in the agreement. They can still be found affiliated for other reasons. And in fact, if parties are affiliated at the time they enter into the mentor-protege agreement, SBA might not approve it or they might terminate it down the road. But if you see your relationship with the company developing and you're like, well, that could be risky, think about how to maybe structure it under a mentor-protege relationship to kind of help avoid some of those issues going forward. So with that, you know, I know we're kind of against the hour here, but again, I wanted to raise these issues not to make anybody an expert when it comes to affiliation or size-related issues, but again, just so you kind of have the knowledge so that maybe the light bulb goes off and you say, I need to reach out to Jody or I need to reach out to Matt. And with that, you know, my contact information is on the screen. Please feel free to reach out at any time with any questions. Connect with me on LinkedIn. Follow us on GovCon Brief. You know, we are certainly happy to connect and to answer any questions that folks might have. So Jody, if there are any, I'm happy to take them. Otherwise, you know, I hope everybody has a wonderful day.
Thanks, Matt. So currently, I don't see any questions, but that last little bit, you know, even my brain's churning away, and I might not have articulated questions yet. So let me open it up to the audience. If you need clarification or want Matt to repeat anything, you don't necessarily have to type it out. Just go ahead and click that raise hand button and be glad to unmute you. A lot of great information. I imagine everybody's out there verifying and checking against, you know, what you've just said against what their day-to-day practice is. So any questions, anyone? Okay, well, this is my assumption, and I'm proud of this assumption, that if there's no questions, that the presentation was so brilliantly articulated
I've
that
answered
no
everything.
questions remain.
Yeah, my job here is done, right?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Well, I still don't see any questions. And, even listening to this a second time, I picked up some new stuff and new ways of thinking of that. And that affiliation is incredibly tricky topic when you are on that cusp of growth. So, and we have a great audience that fits right in that for this. So what I'm going to do is, even though once the webinar ends, it doesn't mean you don't get to ask questions, because often I think of something after it's too late to ask readily. So follow up. You do have Matt's contact information there. Also, it's in the handouts.
Yep.
And if you want, let me quick swap my screen and I can bring up the PTAC point of contact information. Or you can, again, just reach out, change this, and then bring it over to here. So here's our contact information for PTAC. So reach out to us, and even if the question is, hey, can you give me Matt's contact information? We're happy to help. So I'm showing us at 11:30, 11:31. I want again to thank everyone for joining us today. And Matt, I truly love listening to you present. If you get tired of being an attorney, you should look at doing recorded audiobooks because you have a fantastic voice. And I really, truly appreciate your presentation style. And as
Thank you
always, the
very much. It's
information
always
is
a
great.
pleasure to join y'all.
Yeah, absolutely. And check out the GovCon brief. I have a subscription to it, and I use those articles all the time. So fabulous information. Well, at this point in time, I'm going to go ahead and close for any questions and wish everyone a fantastic day. Stay safe, stay warm. And if you need us, we're here to help.